Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Season 4, Episode 19, Hard Time. I did my first video for a Deep Space Nine episode 4 months ago, so I think I might be a little overdue for another one. I said I was going to do some Deep Space Nine episodes, and so far I've only done one. I feel like I may have let down my audience a bit. What can I say? Life gets in the way. I get other ideas bouncing around inside my head like a pinball. I get distracted, but I never want to make any empty promises, so I do apologize. And this episode might be a weird one to talk about. I picked it because I wanted to pick an episode that kind of made me angry. And this episode definitely does, but it's not as bad as I originally thought it was. I used to think that it was just a straight up bad episode. And if I'm being objective, it's really not. I think my dislike for this episode stems from my own emotional reaction to it. It's a Chief O'Brien gets tortured episode, and I think it's fair to say that this is the worst of the various tortures he's had to endure. It's a very heavy episode, but that's not why I dislike it. Duet is a heavy episode as well, and I love that. I think we'll have to explore why it is that I hate it as we go. So we'll see what thoughts come to mind as I go over this one. And I also thought this episode happened much earlier in the show's run. I feel like I remember this being a Season 2 or Season 3 episode, but it's late Season 4. I don't know. My memory is just going, I guess. But regardless, I think we should just get started. The episode opens up in a dark prison cell, and a very disheveled Miles O'Brien is drawing some kind of picture in some sand. A voice on the loudspeaker announces something about decontamination, and a beam sweeps through the room and erases O'Brien's drawing. Then a couple of aliens walk in and tell O'Brien that he's free to go. He's been here for 20 cycles, and the standard amount of time for his crime is 15 cycles. And the cycles in this episode translate to years for us, so we can assume 20 cycles is 20 years. So O'Brien is free to go, and suddenly he wakes up in some sort of examination room on a table, and Major Kira tells him that it hasn't been 20 years, it's only been a few hours. Apparently, he was arrested by this alien species and charged with espionage. He was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but not actual prison. They created an artificial reality that allowed him to experience 20 years inside of a prison cell within the span of a few hours. So while Major Kira brings him back to the station, Cisco talks to O'Brien's wife, Keiko, about what happened. Apparently, Kira and O'Brien were visiting a planet in the Gamma Quadrant called Agratha, and the Agrathi people felt that O'Brien was asking too many questions about their technology, so they decided to charge and convict him of espionage for just asking questions. Holy shit. How about you start with shut up? You're asking too many questions, shut your mouth. How about you start with that instead of sentencing him to 20 years inside Matrix jail? And how they were able to do this to a Federation citizen, a member of Starfleet, I'll never know. Who the hell are these people? It's crazy that these little pissant aliens had the audacity to charge an outsider with a crime like this and then carry out the sentence before even informing Starfleet about it. Is that not an act of war? I think it should be. I'm letting my inner despot come out a bit here, but whatever. If this is how this society treats people, then it's already beyond repair. So I don't have a problem with someone conquering it. I know the Federation doesn't do that sort of thing, but can you imagine if they had done this to a member of the Klingon Empire, or the Romulans, or the Cardassians? Their little shit planet would be gone. But to be fair, they are a species that's in the Gamma Quadrant, so they could be associated with the Dominion, which would make attacking them a little more complicated. But still, there has to be some sort of retribution for this. It just has to be. It's pretty clear the only reason they did it was because they knew the Federation wouldn't have the backbone to do anything about it. I mean, that's kind of where you need to show a little backbone, in my opinion. But as far as I know, that never happens. And maybe that's really the core of why this episode pisses me off so much. But moving on, finally. Kira brings him aboard the station, and O'Brien is understandably confused by all this. He thinks he left this life behind 20 years ago, but he's back. And to everyone else, it's as though he never really left. He talks to Dr. Bashir, and he tells him that he was alone in his cell the entire time. But a flashback shows that he had an Agrathi cellmate named Ichar. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Bashir then talks to Keiko and explains O'Brien's condition. He says he can't remove the 20 years of memories without wiping his entire memory, which is a bit weird because they have definitely partially erased memories in the past. Although I can't think of an example of that off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure they have. I mean, maybe it was my memory that was partially erased. Who the hell knows? But Bashir tries to reassure Keiko that Miles will be okay in time. He says that he's been through a lot of terrible things in his life. The war on Setlik 3, being taken prisoner by Cardassians and put on trial. So because of that, Bashir thinks O'Brien is strong enough to get past this in time, which I think is kind of a bold assumption. I mean, I know they say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but I'm not sure I subscribe to that because everyone has a breaking point. And when you couple O'Brien's other bad experiences with this one, he might be closer to collapse than ever before. And there's only so much trauma a person can deal with. And even if his life had been sunshine and roses up to this point, it might be over for him. But in any case, he finally sees Keiko. They embrace and have dinner with their daughter, Molly. And it's pretty clear O'Brien is having a lot of trouble readjusting. He unconsciously begins rationing some of the food from his plate so he could save it for later. And when Keiko questions why he's doing that, it seems like he wasn't even aware that he was doing it. And he explains it by saying that in his cell, the guards wouldn't feed him regularly. He would sometimes have to go days, if not weeks, without food. So rationing it was essential. And in another flashback, we see O'Brien is starting to lose it in his cell. And Ichar shows him how to draw what he calls a sikis, a geometric pattern that can supposedly relax the body and mind. Ichar is very kind to O'Brien and helps him develop coping mechanisms for this awful situation that they're both in. But they're not helping O'Brien readjust to life on the station. He plays darts with Worf, but he's not really into it. And Worf asks O'Brien if he would rather go kayaking in the holosuite. O'Brien declines. But Worf is such a fascinating character. He's such a good friend. He's always there for his friends. He honors them, as he would probably put it. But if his son Alexander suggested kayaking or playing darts, Worf would probably say, no, you got to learn how to be a warrior. It's just weird how he holds Alexander to this unreachable Klingon standard. I'm looking forward to talking about Alexander on Deep Space Nine because I think that is a whole can of worms, or in this case, a whole can of gach. But regardless, we'll get to that when we get to that. Dr. Bashir confronts O'Brien because he hasn't been going to his counseling sessions. And O'Brien gets agitated and says he doesn't need counseling. He just wants to be left alone. He also lashes out at Bashir and says that he's sick of his smug, superior attitude. He then goes to Quark's and threatens him over a synth ale. He also sits down at a table and has a conversation with a hallucination of Ichar. It's not going great for O'Brien, needless to say. Sisko now speaks to him, and he tells him that Dr. Bashir is relieving him of duty, and he's ordered to report for daily counseling sessions. Angry, he goes and yells at Bashir, says he doesn't want help or friendship. He heads to his quarters, where he snaps at his daughter Molly. He nearly hits her. It's a very shocking moment. And it's hard to imagine him recovering from this at this point. So he leaves and heads to some kind of storage room. At first I wanted to call it a cargo hold, but I don't know why a space station would be hauling cargo. So it's some sort of glorified broom closet. And he starts smashing stuff. It's too bad there's no big blue barrels for him to knock over, because Worf would appreciate his bravery. And he opens up a phaser compartment and takes one. Why there's a wall of phasers in this seemingly random room that is not an armory, I'll never know. But he sets the phaser on maximum and holds it to his chin. Thankfully, Bashir walks in and tries to talk him down. I'm not sure how he found him, because O'Brien threw his communicator badge away in a fit of rage. And as we know, you can't find anybody on a ship or a space station without their communicator for some reason. But he miraculously found him here, so that's nice. And O'Brien says he's not doing this for him. He's doing it to protect Molly and Keiko and everyone else. He says he's dangerous. He eventually tells Bashir about Ichar. He talks about how he was his cellmate and how they were starving. It was the longest they'd gone without food, and their rations had run out. In a flashback, he catches Ichar going for some food he had been hiding. They fight over it, and O'Brien kills him, only to realize that Ichar had been saving the food for both of them. I don't know why Ichar wouldn't have just told him this, but he never did. So O'Brien killed him for nothing, and the next day they ended up feeding him anyway. And O'Brien talks about how he grew up being told that mankind had outgrown hate and rage. He feels he failed to show that he was an evolved human being. You know, a human living up to the Roddenberry standard, if you will. He repaid kindness with blood. He says he's no better than a wild animal. And Bashir says this.
No. An animal would have killed Ichar and never had a second thought, never shed a tear. But not you. You hate yourself. You hate yourself so much you think you deserve to die. The Agrathi did everything they could to strip you of your humanity. And in the end, for one brief moment, they succeeded. But you can't let that brief moment define your entire life. If you pull that trigger, then the Agrathi will have won. They will have destroyed a good man.
It's kind of interesting that he uses the word trigger. A phaser is really more of a button than a trigger. But regardless, he's got a point. To be human is to feel, even if it means feeling like shit. I mean, the Agrathi intended to destroy O'Brien. If he ends his life here, they will have accomplished their heinous goal. So O'Brien lets go of the phaser. The figment of Ichar appears and wishes O'Brien well, and then fades. And in the final scene, Bashir gives O'Brien some meds and says it will take time, but he will get through this. O'Brien thanks him, and Bashir says, "What are friends for?" He goes to his quarters and hugs Molly, and that's how the episode ends. Overall, I'm of two minds on this episode. On the one hand, I think it's a great portrayal of PTSD. I think it's well acted. I think it's emotional. And I once took some criticism for my comments on the original series episode, The Doomsday Machine, because I thought William Wyndham as Commodore Decker was hamming it up with his portrayal of PTSD. I mean, that's just the nature of acting in 60s TV shows. But a couple people took offense to that because they thought it was an accurate portrayal of PTSD and that I was making fun of it. And to be fair, they might have a lot more experience with PTSD than I do. So maybe they're right. But in my opinion, this is a much more accurate and grounded portrayal of PTSD. I think 9 times out of 10, this is what it would be like. And it wouldn't really be whatever Decker was doing. Just my opinion. So I appreciate this episode on that level, but I also hate it because there are these little assholes on this planet out there somewhere in the Gamma Quadrant, and they're not only doing this sort of thing to their own people, they're doing it to outsiders too, for absolutely zero crime. And I guess it bothers me that they just kind of get away with it. I know it's not very Star Trek of me, but I want some revenge. especially because it's O'Brien. He does not deserve this. I mean, no one deserves this, but especially O'Brien. He's truly a kind person at his core. He's a good friend. He loves his family. Even when his wife can't shut up about botany, he loves it. He also hates killing. He's still haunted by the Cardassian he had to kill on Setlik 3. Wait a minute. It was Setlik 3, right? I'm confusing it with Cestus 3, which is the planet that Captain Kirk fought the Gorn on. But no, it is Setlik 3 where O'Brien fought the Cardassians. My point is, he's a good man. And these aliens tried to destroy him for no reason whatsoever. I mean, if I was Sisko, I'd be saying, let's take the Defiant out for a spin. If you see what I'm driving at. I mean, I can't help but wonder what Captain Kirk would have done in this episode. I think these aliens would have had their technology completely destroyed by Kirk. Because if you're going to torture and imprison people for no reason, you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. And then some bureaucratic Starfleet admiral would have called Kirk and been like, hey, did you just destroy an entire planet's prison system? And Kirk would have been like, yes, I did. You're welcome. And then they would have moved on. Happy ending. So that's one thing I don't like about the episode. And I also don't like that O'Brien is completely fine by the next episode. I know that's the nature of television, especially from this era, but the effects of this don't linger, and they would. I'm sure they have some great meds in the 24th century, but he'd still be dealing with this for a long time. So even in a show that has more connective tissue from episode to episode than most shows of this era, they still felt the need to hit the reset button at the end of it, which I get, but it's still kind of annoying. And if you think about it, this episode is kind of like the evil version of The Inner Light, the Next Generation episode, The Inner Light. You know, the episode where Picard lives a whole life, has a family with members of a long-dead civilization, and he wakes up like nothing happened. And that would be difficult to deal with too, but at least he had a warm bed, a family that cared about him. He didn't have to murder his friend. So in that regard, Hard Time is like the evil Inner Light. And the concept of this episode may be somewhat prophetic, as scary as that sounds, because people actually want to do this sort of thing with virtual reality technology. And maybe it could work, but only if the artificial conditions are humane. And it's hard to believe that they would be. But in any case, it's ultimately a fine episode. I guess it's just not one that I have a desire to revisit all that often. And as I said, I think it's a good portrayal of PTSD, but not the best. I think the better example of PTSD in Star Trek is Nog in It's Only a Paper Moon. That episode is a masterpiece, in my opinion. And this episode, it just kind of leaves me wondering what the point of it was. Like, why do we have to torture O'Brien like this all the time? It makes no sense. But let me know what you think of this one. And I'm sorry for the sporadic videos. I'm going to try to be a little bit more consistent from now on. We'll see how that goes. But for now, thanks for watching. And until next time, take it easy.